Sammer, so what's going on? Why do people behave like this? Why do police officers end up committing suicide? The Russian-speaking Igor, who I think took out about 130 terrorists, I think, when he ran to his family.
Well, not 130, 13. Igor Pivev, yes, may he rest in peace.
13 terrorists, and I think I saw an interview with him. He was such a tough guy, seemed fine, and then suddenly, just like that, he committed suicide. Now, a lot of soldiers have started doing the same thing. Why? What's going on? Don't you have psychologists? Is it some kind of post-traumatic syndrome? What's happening in Israel?
You've touched on a very sensitive topic. I just want to say that the situation is actually much worse. Unfortunately, almost every day, we have suicides among servicemen who took part in the events of October 7th. And they participated heroically. Basically, they acted heroically, and there was no reason to think they would be left with any trauma. Despite the fact that the story of Igor Pivev, may he rest in peace, was truly shocking for the whole country, because shortly before his death he gave an interview to one of our Israeli bloggers, where he basically admitted that he was tormented by nightmares and suffered from post-trauma. The essence of post-trauma is that there are different kinds of post-trauma. In his case, as he claimed, the essence of his post-trauma was that he suffered because he supposedly blamed himself for not saving enough people. He eliminated about 13 militants, and he was rushing to his city, where his family and children were. And he says that maybe, if I had turned off the road there and gone to another town, another village, maybe I could have saved more people. But he acted heroically. Basically, he behaved relatively cool-headedly. Well, to eliminate 13 militants in different locations, you need to have a certain level of composure and a certain amount of courage. In other words, he didn't panic, which means he conducted himself with dignity. But people of that kind, of that category, personally, it's hard for me to imagine someone so resilient being tormented by pangs of conscience, even if he had them, to the point that they could drive him to suicide. Besides Igor, there were also several other incidents that raised questions. Recently, just a few days ago, another military man, a combat officer who took part in the fighting on October 7th, while on vacation, I think in Cyprus, drowned. So, the man drowned. How can someone drown? Well, either you don't know how to swim, or you go in while drunk, or maybe something happened to him while he was in the water. But I repeat once again, a combat officer who went through serious battles, meaning he actually fought, drowned. There's another nuance here, and it's probably considered part of a conspiracy theory. A conspiracy theory, yes. The conspiracy theory that things aren't so clear-cut, and more information keeps coming out suggesting that the events of October 7th are far from straightforward. That is, today, probably, at least in Israel, there's probably not a single person who hasn't heard various theories that this wasn't a spontaneous attack by the Hamas group, that among the Hamas militants, apparently, there were some other people involved in this attack, who, judging by everything, were actually military personnel. These could be some mercenaries, or they could be fighters from foreign special services. There were coordinators there. There's even a version being put forward that, in the video recordings, you can hear that one of the coordinators is speaking Hebrew, not from those who were defending themselves, but from those who were attacking. And this topic has been circulating for almost 2 years now since that event, a little less than 2 years. There are even entire television channels and YouTube channels that are have dedicated, and continue to dedicate themselves specifically to this issue. What exactly happened on October 7th? How could this have happened? How did it come to this? Where was the army? Where were the special services? Where was the intelligence? What exactly was going on there? How could such a large-scale attack take place? From open sources, it can already be said unequivocally that for more than 12 hours, IDF units, the Israel Defense Forces, were stationed on the outskirts of these settlements where the terrorist attack and mass killings were taking place, and they were not allowed in. They were given the order not to enter there. Well, an order like that, we have this understanding in the army. That is, you need to strive for contact. We have this regulation, striving for contact with the enemy, not waiting for an order. But if there's an enemy and he is carrying out hostile actions, you need to immediately seek contact with him so that you can neutralize him as much as possible. Where does this come from? This doctrine says that first and foremost, the opponent, the enemy, the adversary must be stopped at any cost, and only then, that is, stop him so that he does not cause, so that there are no further civilian casualties. So, he needs to be stopped first, and then you deal with the situation as it develops. And this regulation, it was practically not followed on any of the fronts. The second piece of information, which also comes from open sources, says that there was also a landing of militants from the sea, from the Mediterranean. And so a battle broke out along this coastline, and for unclear reasons, a large number of militants landed from the sea as well. At that moment, in the coastal area, Israeli military boats were patrolling. And there are witnesses who claim they saw these boats. But these boats did nothing. They did not resist. Some even claim that fire was opened from the sea onto the shore, targeting civilians, and it's unclear who was shooting from the sea, but someone could have been firing from there. And there was a landing from the sea, literally an assault force that landed on the shore and began advancing on the settlement, opening fire on the residents, on the civilians who were on the beach. So, what we're talking about here is a much larger scale attack than what the media is reporting. And this is exactly the topic you brought up. It agitates Israel every day. Soldiers are dying, specifically those who took part in that clash on the 23rd, in the year 2023, on October 7th. And they are dying for the following reasons. The first official version is that it's suicide. And here you also touched on something important. Is it really true that there are no psychologists? There are psychologists. There are psychologists in every unit, in the army, in the police, in the special services, in intelligence. There are psychologists. And until now, in previous conflicts, there hasn't been such a number of suicides among servicemen. And I don't want to draw any conclusions. Let everyone draw their own conclusions. But if you compare these two factors, what happened during those events, something was going on there that, perhaps, these servicemen could have encountered. And the second point is that many servicemen who specifically took part in those battles on October 7th, 2023, are in relatively large numbers, in abnormal numbers. I mean, there have always been suicides. This happens in every army. There's trauma, there's post-trauma. But such a large number of suicides among servicemen, specifically those who participated in these events, is abnormal. And this raises a lot of questions not only for you, Steve, but also for many journalists and media outlets. But this still isn't being covered widely or on a large scale yet, because firstly, a lot of information doesn't make it past military censorship. Right now, military censorship, or the military censorship machine, is running at full capacity. Currently, military censorship checks every article, every news summary, every broadcast, every report, and a lot of information remains behind the scenes. Apparently, there's something to hide. So,
all right, what about you? What do you think? Come on, I want to hear your opinion. What do you think this is all about?
well, my personal opinion hasn't changed since the first days after this event. I want to say that on October 7th, there were two music festivals. One was in the Negev Desert, not far from the Dead Sea, near the border with Jordan. The other was on the border with the Gaza Strip. The attack happened specifically on the border with the Gaza Strip. My personal opinion formed right away, literally within a few hours. By the way, I happened to be in the south at that moment, and at 6 in the morning I was there. I was working there, but I was working near the second festival, not the one that was on the territory of the Gaza Strip. We spent the night there, me and some of my colleagues. It's a job that lasts several days. There was this big music festival there. We were nearby, and we spent the night there, in these, well, kind of dormitory-like accommodations. And really, at 6 in the morning, everyone was woken up, the sirens started, and the rocket attack began. And literally, right then, people started calling me, asking me to comment on what was happening. I immediately started commenting that this was a large-scale attack, and that it was definitely being carried out by a regular army. When, a few hours later the next day, it became known that this was the work of the Hamas group, not just me, but probably half the country simply couldn't believe that Hamas could carry out such a large-scale attack with so many casualties, such mass killing. Besides the fact that there was a music festival there, and besides the fact that the festival had received permission from the police, this kind of thing happens all the time. It's very strict. Every event gets permission from the local police. The police receive and gather information from the Internal Security Service and from the armed forces. Everyone gave the green light for the festival to be held. It was precisely because of the festival, and I want to point out, by the way, that this was the first time a festival was held literally right next to the Gaza border fence, with Hamas militants actually on the other side. So this was the first time such a large-scale music festival was held so close, in such immediate proximity. Most of the casualties could have been avoided. I'm sure that more than half, if not more, could have been avoided if the festival hadn't been held there. Who, why, for what reason gave the go-ahead to hold this festival on the very day when this attack happened? That's the first point. Second, my personal opinion is that foreign military personnel took part in the attack. Maybe they were mercenaries, maybe they were some kind of saboteurs, but they definitely weren't just Hamas militants. Like in Israel, they call them fighters and slippers or flip-flops. No, there were regular soldiers from a third party involved. So you asked for my opinion. My personal opinion is that a third party was involved there. And definitely, judging by everything, it was some kind of Western party. There weren't mercenaries from China. There weren't mercenaries from India, from Iran, or from Russia. There's a theory that Russian intelligence services could have provoked and initiated this. These were mercenaries. And all the planning, all the coordination, the way it was carried out, the brutality, that brutality, it was all done deliberately. There was indescribable brutality there. The acts of cruelty that were committed there take many hours to carry out. It was during those 13 hours or so, when the army was not allowed to enter and engage the enemy, that these terrible things were happening. And that very brutality, those levels of cruelty, were most likely intentional. They were one of the objectives. Because it's hard to imagine that people did what they did simply because they enjoyed it. Of course, there were some thugs there. Of course, there were some hardened killers, but they did it. Let me just finish up now. They did it because they knew they had time. That's one. And second, they were given the task to do what they did, in the way they did it.
Tell me, Amr, so does it truly turn out that if it weren't for the decisive actions of ordinary citizens and the dedicated police force, the entire elaborate setup was designed for Israel to be utterly defeated? Is that really right? Did someone, just regular, everyday people and the diligent police, just completely mess up their carefully laid plans?
First of all, yes. Ordinary police officers engaged in the fight.
The army couldn't be sent in, but no one was holding back the police. And they went.
So let's start with the fact that in Israel, a very large number of residents are armed with their own personal weapons. and those residents of the suburbs along the line of contact with the Gaza Strip, these settlements and kibbutzim, most of the residents there were armed with their own personal weapons. In addition, each of these settlements had what was called a private military company. That is, there was a company there responsible for guarding these settlements. So, not the army, not the police, but in addition to the army and the police, there were also private military firms that handled this, the security of these settlements. By the way, that's just a separate topic. I'm just bringing up facts as we go along in the conversation. By the way, these rapid response groups had their weapons confiscated and locked away in safes just a few days before this happened. And at the moment when the rapid response group fighters tried to fight back, since they were inside these settlements, they were simply woken up by the attack itself, by the fact that the assault had started. They couldn't open those safes for a long time because, well, I'll say this phrase, even though it already sounds both ridiculous and sacrilegious, they couldn't find the key to the safe. And in several settlements, what happened was that these fighters simply had nothing to defend themselves with. But most people did fight back. Exactly what you said. These were ordinary residents, servicemen who were in the reserves. All of them had their own weapons at home. Police officers, just regular traffic police, the road police who were simply patrolling the roads, they joined the fight. Police officers like Igor Pivev, patrol officers who were just on duty, patrolling. And even those who weren't on duty, they just heard from social media, they saw what was happening. And the information started spreading like wildfire. And they took their weapons, got into their cars, without any official order, without following protocol that says you need to seek contact with the enemy. They were the ones who went and engaged in the fight. But outside of this, figuratively speaking, there were units standing by that weren't allowed in. So it was those inside this ring, this sector, who actually entered the fight. And unfortunately, most of these people died. But it was precisely them who, in essence, stopped this attack. And to answer your question, what could the plan have been? There are different versions, but theoretically, the plan was as follows: to attack and capture one of the largest cities in Israel, which is located in the south. It is, I think, the 5th or 6th largest city in Israel, Ashkelon. It's quite a large city, a resort town on the Mediterranean coast. If they had managed to capture the city of Ashkelon, we would be talking about thousands of hostages, not to mention tens of thousands of casualties. Thousands of hostages, that is, the capture of several cities in Israel, could basically be considered, well, a defeat for Israel, right? So, if the south of the country were captured, imagine that an enemy army, in this case this group, captures. About 6 small and medium-sized towns were taken, but if they had also taken Ashkelon, then basically, that would mean that Israeli security forces and the government would already be negotiating. Essentially, the militants could have set terms for capitulation. I mean, just imagine thousands of hostages who are in their own homes. They simply wouldn't have been able to free them. And yes, there was a possibility. There was a plan to seize these major cities and basically try to force, I don't know, the Israeli government to surrender or to some other kind of, maybe the situation would have gone a different way than it has now. But going back, I and many others. But in my personal opinion, it was actually the ordinary residents of Israel and the soldiers who were simply in their homes, who basically foiled this plan, the plan of a third party. I'll say it again, I don't like to use the term that this was a Hamas attack. There were some militants, soldiers, mercenaries among Hamas who took part in it. Call it what you want, but there was definitely some third party involved. And I believe the plan was foiled, because it was supposed to cause much more large-scale damage to Israel, even leading to negotiations on a completely different level. And the negotiations were supposed to be nothing like what we see now. Right now, they're talking about freeing, I think, around 40 or 50 hostages left. But in that scenario, it would have been about freeing thousands. And with that many hostages, no rescue operation would be possible. In other words, negotiations would have been the only option. And fortunately, we'll never know what kind of demands would have been made to the Israeli government if that many hostages had been taken.
Yeah, of course, it's definitely interesting. Of course, on one hand, it's all conspiracy theories, but on the other hand, it's really fascinating because when you talk about the suicide, it's so strange. A person drowned, then something else happened to another one. Yeah, maybe it's actually true. All right, let's get back to Syria now, because honestly, the situation is getting confusing again. It seemed like Jelani had reached an agreement with Israel. Everything was fine. It looked like the sanctions were lifted, and Jelani even put on a suit. Everything seemed pretty civilized. And suddenly, after the Alawites, after what happened with the destruction of the Alawites, I mean, I get it, the Alawites kept Syria in fear for a long time. So,
Exactly right.
but now the Druze have risen up. And I know that Israel has gotten involved in a new conflict. Of course, it was short-lived, and Israel clashed with the Syrian army. Well, if you can call it that, because their army is not that big. What's happening?
What happens is this. My personal opinion is
Yes.
the following. There is a fight or struggle for power between an entire clique or an entire clan, the face of which is our prime minister. That is, he is fighting. I'm sure there is a whole group of people behind him, maybe even an entire bloc, maybe even some kind of elite at the macro level. But there is a struggle for power at any cost to stay in power. And this is no longer a coincidence. This is already a pattern. I want to point out that before the war, before June 13th, when the war between Israel and Iran began, literally a day before that, on the night before Israel's attack on Iran, the Israeli government was hanging by a thread. Parliament was supposed to be dissolved, and Netanyahu was about to lose his position. This was happening against the backdrop of him, well, not just him, but basically the general staff getting into a conflict with a particular segment of Israeli society, the religious, ultra-Orthodox community. I want to point out here that they have about 100,000 young men who, in principle, represent a significant potential military resource, but who simply are not drafted into the army. And today, this is like a breath of fresh air for the general staff, for the Israeli armed forces. Because, as you can understand, Israel has actually been fighting on 4 fronts for the past 2 years: Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Yemeni Houthis. Now a 5th front has opened up with Syria. There is a shortage of resources, a shortage of weapons, and a shortage of manpower. The religious ultra-Orthodox absolutely do not want to send their children to serve in the army. And the fact that they practically don't pay taxes, hardly work, and are fully supported by the secular part of society's budget is a separate issue. Nevertheless, they are threatening Netanyahu that if the law on mandatory military service passes, which, by the way, is being actively promoted by our compatriot, Soviet Union native Yuli Edelstein, who turned out to be quite a principled politician. But still, I think this is all just a show, but nevertheless, let's assume that all of this is actually happening for real. Yuli Edelstein, who holds a rather high position, is number 2 in the Likud party. In fact, he is being predicted as Netanyahu's successor. But I think he will never become the prime minister of Israel, because there is an unspoken rule in Israel. Those who are not born on Israeli territory, meaning not native-born Israelis, but those who came here, no matter at what age, will never become prime minister in the modern history of Israel. The fact that Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, or Menachem Begin were not born in Israel was because, at that time, Israel was still very young and there simply weren't leaders. There was practically no generation that had been born there. But now, almost 80 years later, there are already people in the 3rd generation who were born in Israel. And it's kind of an unspoken rule that, When someone becomes prime minister, basically, the prime minister will be granted access at the highest level. And we have two politicians who, in principle, are quite strong potential candidates for this position. They are Avigdor Lieberman, who comes from the USSR, and Yuli Edelstein, also originally from the USSR. Up until today, almost all prime ministers have been native-born Israelis. And this is an issue that, well, nobody talks about, basically because people just don't want to pay attention to it. But nevertheless, let's get back to the problem. Yuli Edelstein, being a very principled politician, is pushing for a law on universal military conscription. The religious ultra-Orthodox threaten to break up the coalition, dissolve the government, and call for new elections. Netanyahu, of course, doesn't want that, and he wants to stay in power at any cost. The night before the government was to be dissolved, an attack began. Netanyahu, naturally, is the only one who, as commander-in-chief and leader of the country, can give such an order. He gave the order to strike Iran. Now the war is over. It lasted 12 days. And literally the next day, when everything had already calmed down and a ceasefire was announced between Iran and Israel, the issue of this law was once again put on the agenda. And Yuli Edelstein said, "No, I won't back down," to put it bluntly. And he started trying to push this amendment through Parliament again. They had already tried to impeach him, and they had also tried to impeach the Chief Justice to remove her from her post, since she doesn't take a direct part in this. But as the highest legal authority, she asserts that everything, meaning she supports the agenda of universal military conscription. They're also trying to remove her from her position, even though according to the laws of the Israeli constitution, that's not allowed. By law, they can't strip her of her authority. That's why they're trying to introduce an amendment. In other words, if there were a constitution, this would be an attempt to change the constitution, which, in principle, is forbidden in a civilized world, in a democracy. For example, in the US, the constitution is untouchable. In Russia, they can change the constitution almost every Saturday and Sunday. But usually, a constitution isn't changed. It is an unshakable foundation of internal law, the law by which the entire state and all its residents and citizens live, no matter what position they hold, including the president and the prime minister. Nevertheless, they're trying by all sorts of tricks to completely discredit this law. A day before the start of the war between Israel and Syria, the situation also reached a boiling point. When we have two powerful parties of religious ultra-Orthodox, they threatened the government's coalition and the dissolution of parliament. And then a military operation in Syria began. Once again, I return to my strictly personal opinion. There needed to be a pretext, and going back just a little bit further. This is another attempt by Netanyahu to cling to power. That is, God knows how many more rabbits he has left in his hat, but this is one rabbit he pulled out. This was the war with Iran. Now, as if out of nowhere and unexpectedly for many, a new conflict has suddenly arisen, one for which there were no preconditions. You were right when you mentioned Giuliani here. He met with Trump. Giuliani, his regime was recognized by most Western countries. Basically, Giuliani, even though he's a militant, a former Al-Qaeda militant, mind you, is now generally considered the legitimate president and legitimate leader of fallen Syria. A civil war has started in Syria. Yes, it started there, and it's still going on. There are ethnic cleansings happening there, yes. Against Alawites, Christians, Kurds, and Druze. These minorities have lived there for centuries, and they have their own armed groups. Even if there were some clashes, they could always stand up for themselves. Now suddenly, once again, for a reason that, again, I'm just expressing my personal opinion here, there were no obvious, visible reasons to start a military operation with Syria, since Giuliani's army, which many officers and soldiers from Assad's army joined, had, in principle, sworn an oath to defend their country. And Giuliani promised that there would be no ethnic cleansing. The minority known as the Druze had been living throughout this entire territory even before the creation of Israel. Back then, there were no borders until they were drawn up by Sykes-Picot after the First World War, just drawn with a ruler dividing up the Middle East. And many families, not just the Druze, but also Bedouins, Christians, Kurds, Alawites, ended up on different sides of these borders. It's just like what happened to the Soviet people, who suddenly woke up the next morning to find themselves on the other side of a border. In other words, families were simply split apart because the parade of sovereignties began, and all the countries, all the republics, gained independence. The same thing, a similar situation, happened in the Middle East. The Druze minority is quite an integral ethnic group in Israel, and they live in the north, on the border with Syria. Many of their relatives live just across the fence, in Lebanon and Syria. And there, well, other relatives live in Israel, in the north, around the Golan Heights. So it turned out that suddenly Druze people started getting killed in Syria. It's still unclear who started the killings. Some militants are gangs, apparently because, well, we're told that Giuliani has a regular army and his regime is recognized. That means he should act legitimately. He should behave in accordance with international law. I think that the militants who used to be militants are now Assad's army. Well, in theory, if even Donald Trump met with him, that's a very significant sign, a symbolic gesture, then he should be putting an end to anarchy in his own country. But suddenly, information started spreading, this kind of information field, in the media, that there was a massacre of Druze going on. They really did open the gates at the border, and the Druze, the residents living near the border, they basically ran. Everyone saw those scenes. They went there in cars, on foot, some with weapons in hand, to defend their relatives. My personal opinion is that this was, in a way, under the cover of all this, the beginning of a military operation, because among those Druze there were likely disguised Israeli soldiers. And what happened was a crossing of the border into Syrian territory. And there, a military operation began, supposedly under the pretext of protecting the Druze. Let me repeat, this happened one day before the planned collapse of the government and Netanyahu stepping down from power. So, adding one and one, I mean, considering Iran and Syria, I assume that the conflict, the internal political conflict, the collapse of the government, the dissolution of the coalition, and the dissolution of parliament will sooner or later, in the coming days, return to the agenda anyway, unless some kind of force majeure occurs. For example, unless somehow Yuli Edelstein is forced to remove this law from the vote, or a replacement, or a change to some law, or the adoption of a law allowing religious Orthodox Jews not to serve. But that would be a slap in the face to the entire Israeli society. And in Israel, more than half of the people demand that they do serve, especially after the events of October 7th, and especially given the heavy losses the Israeli armed forces suffer every day, and even more so against the backdrop of the high suicide rate among soldiers. In other words, society understands that these tens of thousands of religious young men need to be drafted, at least for a while, to balance Israel, to balance the situation. So I am sure that when the question of dissolving the parliament becomes urgent again, a new war will break out, and this could go on endlessly. As long as the person in power is someone who clings to that power at any cost. I'll even add another element, another factor. For more than a year now, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his group, his office, have been negotiating with Hamas to the fullest extent of their ability to free the remaining hostages held by Hamas. And my personal opinion is that it is not Hamas that does not want to let go or compromise. Most likely it is Netanyahu. He doesn't want to compromise, and he refuses to let them go. And today, by the way, an article was published in our leading newspaper where, more or less openly, they say that it is Netanyahu who is refusing the deal with Hamas, not Hamas refusing the deal with Israel. And why is he refusing? Because these poor, unfortunate hostages are his guarantee for staying in power. In other words, this man has basically taken the whole country hostage, and also those who are the real hostages, the ones held by Hamas, the prisoners of war. So, we can see there's a pattern here. At any cost, this man is trying to stay in power, at the cost of soldiers' lives, at the cost of civilians' lives, and he's willing to put the security of the entire state on the line. I'm convinced that the whole situation today, with the hostages, with the war in Syria, with the war with Iran, by the way, he's threatening that he might, meaning he already has plans to launch a second strike on Iran. I can add that yes, indeed, if the conflict with Syria is resolved in the coming days or weeks, and once again the issue of dissolving the parliamentary coalition and holding new elections comes up, Israel will strike Iran a second time, because, once again, this man will be on the verge of losing his power. And on top of all this, there are ongoing court proceedings, interrogations, and investigations into his 3 criminal corruption cases. And these cases involve criminal charges for bribery, but the bribes were in the form of gifts. Again, I am expressing only my strictly personal opinion. Most likely, there's something much bigger there, something much more serious, something the Prime Minister is involved in, something that has truly caused significant harm to the security of the State of Israel, whether to its residents, its population, or perhaps it's a matter of betrayal on a colossal scale. And it's possible that if even one element becomes public, that element could lead to another, and that one to a third. And it's possible that the full extent or scale of the conspiracy will truly be revealed, a conspiracy in which traitors from the highest echelons of the Israeli government may be directly involved. That's what we're talking about here, Steve, so you understand the scale of it.
The scale? Yes, the scale is certainly very serious. It's even frightening to think about. You know what you're saying, but it all really really seems just like this whole situation. Tell me, please, compared to today, this war with Iran that ended the way it did, it lasted 12 days. Did Israel actually suffer serious losses in this war, or is all the information being hidden? Because they were hitting residential buildings. As I understand it, entire neighborhoods were being demolished. Or is that not the case?
That's true. They demolished, well, not entire neighborhoods, but they did wipe out whole streets. But that happened a few times in one city. One city suffered the most, more than anywhere else. That's the city of Bagam. There, they really did wipe out an entire street. And the second city that suffered the most is the city of Ramat Gan. By the way, your question is timely, because not long ago the Israeli General Staff had to admit that there were direct hits on Israeli military targets from Iran. And those hits were actually quite accurate. And there's a whole list of targets, several military bases, military units, some part of military intelligence, and even an Israeli foreign intelligence facility. There were direct hits on it. In fact, people in Iran started talking about this literally the very next day. But the Israeli media attributed all of this to Iranian propaganda. But recently, the General Staff admitted that such direct hits really did happen. Not to mention the Weizmann Institute, which was involved in research, including military projects. And in the city of Beersheba, there was a strike on a military facility that was engaged in electronic intelligence and new weapons technologies. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the Iranian side had a pretty accurate target make. Against this backdrop, some Israeli leaders, including the chief of the General Staff, immediately stated that the Iranian side is simply saturated through and through with Israeli intelligence. You can't argue with that. That's really the case. And in Iran, as it turned out, unfortunately for the Iranian side, almost the entire upper echelon of secular power, as well as the military leadership, is indeed infiltrated by Israeli spies. In other words, these were either agents who had been planted or recruited. And indeed, that's the case. That's why in Iran they realized that they are very vulnerable to Israel, but they didn't just sit back and do nothing either. And the direct hits on a number of Israeli military sites show that Iranian intelligence had some pretty reliable information. But there's another nuance here, which honestly, for me personally, is just a paradox, one that I still have trouble fully grasping myself. Dozens of Israelis, maybe even hundreds, but for now we're talking about dozens of Israeli residents, Israeli citizens, were working for Iranian intelligence and supplying Iran with information while being inside Israel. By the way, I want to point out that nowadays this is done very easily, and all of it was carried out using social networks. Iranian intelligence managed to recruit dozens of Israeli residents through social networks. And these dozens of Israeli residents were providing the Iranian side, as they say, in real time, with the following information. It wasn't hard for them to send some message while being at a certain location. The Iranian side was able to pinpoint the locations where strikes needed to be carried out. And Israeli residents, who have lived in Israel for quite a long time, basically know all the military sites. We, Israelis, are aware of them. It would never even cross anyone's mind. But to me, it's just utter madness that an Israeli resident would work for Iran, which is carrying out strikes on his own country, the country where he lives, where his relatives live, where, I don't know, he has his home, his family, his children. Well, for me, basically, I just can't wrap my head around it. But let's not dwell on that. Everyone should make their own decision. But there are people who are absolutely without principles. There are dozens of these unprincipled Israelis. They reported and sent information, filmed with video cameras, took photos, transmitted coordinates, helped the Iranian side track their phone device that was near some facility. So these people could send a message and leave the place. And then, a case like this actually happened. A missile hit a military base that had been located using this very method. So that's the kind of situation we're dealing with. Dozens of Israelis helped Iran precisely as a result of this large-scale espionage, or rather, this widespread betrayal among ordinary Israeli citizens. Because of this, Iran was partly successful in striking Israeli targets. By the way, I also want to mention that successfully striking Israeli military targets isn't that difficult, since Israel is a very small and densely populated country. Military facilities are located close to residential, densely populated areas, and those densely populated areas are, in turn, close to military sites. And there are a lot of military sites, because Israel is a highly militarized state. In other words, people say about Israel that it's not a country with an army, but rather one big army that has its own country. And unfortunately, hitting a military target isn't difficult. But there's another consequence here. Striking a military target inevitably causes damage to nearby residential areas as well. And that's just how things are. That's the situation. And if, going back a bit, the Prime Minister, who is trying to cling to power at any cost, makes such a reckless decision and gives the order for a second strike on Iran. And after the first strike, some time has already passed, and Iran has managed to regroup and prepare, and they're not hiding it. The Iranian leadership claims that they are ready for a full-scale war with Israel. If he takes such a reckless step, it will bring colossal damage to Israel, because in my personal opinion, and I repeat, this time Donald Trump will not stand up for Israel, and he is signaling to Netanyahu not to start this war, since Donald Trump is not going to send his strategic aviation to defend Israel a second time. Understanding that Israel's behavior is very much driven by the personal impulses and ambitions of one man. In other words, Donald Trump is not going to send the American army for the personal ambitions of one man, just so he can stay in power.
Sam, please tell me, do you think Iran fought at full strength in this first war or not?
I think they did not fight at full strength. I believe they didn't use all their resources for two reasons. First, many of their military resources, facilities, and systems were sabotaged as a result of operations by Israeli special forces and intelligence, who were on the ground. That is, entire coordination networks, including electronic ones, were blown up there. There were cyber attacks and there were explosions on the ground, as they say, in the field, and many of Iran's systems failed. So, this was also due to sabotage. That's the first reason. Second, I think that Iran was not planning to start a major war with Israel, because, I repeat once again, a clash, a war between Israel and Iran, would be a confrontation between the global West and the global East, in which Iran and Israel are merely proxies. And at a high level, on the macro level, the global West and the global East are constantly in dialogue. And both sides made a decision and agreed not to start a major war. That's why Iran was not allowed to fully escalate. Accordingly, Israel was also not allowed to fully escalate. Israel has types of weapons that it did not use. The way Donald Trump used this conflict, he used it, I have to say, masterfully. He demonstrated to the whole world his military might. The military might of the United States used bombers that left no one indifferent, bombers that, in just 2 days, ended the war, essentially preventing a major global, or let's say regional, war, but it could have escalated into a global one if it had gotten out of control. And in doing so, he put a whole number of leaders from both the West and the East in their place. That is, in a way, he also put Benjamin Netanyahu in his place. And he showed that the United States can act if it wants to, and what they can do if they choose not to. I assume that the consequences will be catastrophic if Israel decides, if its leader is still Netanyahu, and with him as leader, Netanyahu decides to launch a second strike against Iran. I assume that the consequences will be catastrophic if you take into account all these elements I just mentioned, a large number of traitors, and possibly those who have not yet been uncovered by the Internal Intelligence Service, who are working for Iran. By the way, I didn't mention it. They mostly work for money. So here too, if these were some kind of ideologues, well, I don't know if that would make it any more understandable or not, but maybe it would be easier to grasp an ideological motive. For example, if they were originally from Iran and were helping their former homeland. I don't know, like what's happening today quite widely and on a large scale in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Maybe you can understand that to some extent, but to do it just for money and put your own country, your own people at risk, well, that's really the lowest of the low. That's rock bottom. So there are traitors among the population of Israel, and possibly many of them haven't been uncovered yet, entire networks. That's one thing. The targets that, basically, the Iranian side has, the list of targets they haven't hit yet, but could strike. That's the second point. In Iran, they understand that the US won't help Israel a second time. And Donald Trump is signaling this to Israel, signaling it to the Iranian side as well. That's the third point. Donald Trump is trying to get to the final stage of negotiations. In other words, he's still trying to establish a dialogue with Iran and to get the Iranian and Israeli sides to the negotiating table, even if it's through intermediaries. That's the fourth point. So I assume that if such a reckless and ill-advised step is indeed taken by the Israeli side, in my considered opinion, it would only be due to Prime Minister Netanyahu's personal ambitions and political impulses to remain in power.
And now, the last question for today. Tell me, please, I understand that now we're going to get stones, bricks, and even boulders thrown at us. I need to get used to it. Don't you think that the threat of nuclear weapons from Iran towards Israel is kind of like the threat of chemical weapons from Iraq towards America? Do you really think Iran was ready to make a nuclear bomb and use it against Israel? Or is it all just Netanyahu's personal ambitions again?
My personal opinion is this: nuclear weapons. Well, I'm speaking as a scientist. There's a theory of nuclear deterrence, which says the following, and this theory stands up to criticism. So far, no events have disproved it. It says that nuclear weapons aren't weapons of destruction, but weapons of deterrence. And at this point in human history, it has turned out to be the most effective deterrent weapon in human history. Countries that are rivals or adversaries, those that possess nuclear weapons, have not started a war with each other so far precisely because they have these weapons. A vivid example is the USSR and the USA during the Cold War, as well as India and Pakistan. So, these countries have nuclear weapons, and for this reason, peace is maintained there, albeit a cold peace, but still peace. If Iran acquires nuclear weapons, in my personal opinion, if we follow this theory, then, on the contrary, peace will reign in the Middle East. Although in Israel, propaganda is working at full force to claim that supposedly Iran, whose population is about 80 million, that is, they have much more to lose than Israel, poses a threat. As soon as it acquires nuclear weapons, it will immediately, the very next day, attack Israel. But this hypothesis doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Besides, if we believe that Israel has nuclear weapons, then most likely Israel also has a second strike capability. And here we move on to another theory. Countries that possess a second strike capability fall under the theory of mutually assured destruction, known as MAD, which is studied in all political science departments. This hypothesis was formulated back in the 1970s, when it became clear that if a country has a second strike capability, and such a capability is only possible if nuclear weapons are deployed across three mediums, air, land, and sea or underwater, then even if a first strike is delivered on land, a retaliatory strike from the air or sea would follow, resulting in total destruction. It is precisely for this reason that countries do not launch nuclear attacks, because they know that a retaliatory strike would mean total destruction. If Israel has the capability for a retaliatory strike, then the Iranian government, the Iranian regime, no matter how religious, fanatical, or extreme it may be, will not risk the lives of 80 million Iranians, because if Israel is struck, even with a single tactical blow, Israel will most likely respond with total annihilation. To destroy such a gigantic country as Iran, it would take several dozen, if not 100, nuclear warheads. So, when it comes to nuclear weapons, we also need to approach this with logic. A single nuclear bomb or nuclear missile is not capable of wiping a country off the face of the earth. That's a myth. Nuclear weapons do cause truly massive destruction. But the two bombs dropped, the most powerful bombs at the time, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they didn't destroy Japan. They destroyed two districts in two areas, in two cities, the city of Hiroshima and the city of Nagasaki. But Japan didn't surrender because it was destroyed. The Japanese government simply surrendered because it realized that the opponent had a weapon that could cause huge, very massive casualties among the civilian population. That was the reason for the surrender. If Japan had had such a weapon too, it wouldn't have surrendered. It was simply a demonstration of power. So nuclear weapons cannot. They're not capable of eliminating or destroying a country. This is something many people don't know. They don't understand what it really is. It can wipe out a block, destroy a street, or level a city. And even then, it takes dozens of warheads to do that. To have dozens of warheads hit, or to launch a strike with dozens or even hundreds of warheads, you need to actually deliver those warheads. It's not just a matter of pressing a button. That means planes have to take off, dozens of planes, or dozens and hundreds of missiles have to be launched. More than half of those airborne targets will be intercepted. Surface or underwater nuclear delivery systems have to approach the shores or be stationed somewhere in a body of water. These are either ships or submarines. Submarines are very vulnerable. They're relatively easy to sink. Ships too, they're vulnerable because they're visible. These aren't stealth aircraft like the B-2 or other stealth planes, which are generally hard to detect if the radars or locators are outdated. But a ship at sea is very easy to spot. So these targets, these carriers, can also be destroyed. To destroy a country with nuclear weapons, I would say, is almost impossible. You can inflict colossal damage, but you can't destroy it. I believe that the idea that Iran, even if it wanted to launch a nuclear strike, would destroy Israel just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. I'm sure that Iran will not launch a nuclear strike against Israel. And the second point. No one knows for sure yet, in detail, what kind of messianic or messianistic religious ambitions, impulses, and goals the religious spiritual leaders of Iran have. Because there is a theory that if they were to acquire nuclear weapons, their first strike could actually be against the states that are leaders of the Sunni part of the Muslim world, and not against Israel at all. That would be Saudi Arabia and the Arab Emirates, because the hostility between Shia and Sunni is no less, and I would even say it's greater than that between the Shia and Israel. Let me remind you that Iran is the leader of the Shia. The leaders of the Sunnis are Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, the Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. No one will ever know, I hope, who the Iranian regime would potentially target with a first nuclear strike if they acquired such weapons. So, to answer your question, I personally don't believe that Iran, even if it had nuclear weapons, would try to destroy Israel. First of all, it's impossible to destroy Israel. I just explained why. And secondly, I think that, in fact, peace might actually prevail if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons. And here we come back to the point that I'm convinced there are forces. I've often discussed this in my other talks, that there is an elite interested in perpetual war, and they do everything to keep this war going and to cultivate a state of conflict, no matter where, even in Eastern Europe. There is an elite that is interested in making sure the war never ends. And, as it seems to me, this brings us to what I would call my fourth version. I get the impression that the same force stands behind both Israel and Iran, behind the Iranian regime. Because this 12-day war, well, only someone blind couldn't see it. It made it clear to everyone that this was an absolutely staged war. That is, first of all, Iran was allowed to strike. In other words, there was an agreement about where it would carry out its retaliatory strike on Qatari territory, so that there would be no damage, no casualties. They gave Iran the coordinates of where to strike. Iran delivered what I would call blank strikes, just to save face. Because, you see, someone was interested in making sure Iran could save face in the context of the war with Israel. So, this was an absolutely coordinated war. And before this, last year and the year before, Israel and Iran had already exchanged strikes. And as a result of those strikes, no one was harmed. And these strikes were carried out at the coordinates that Israel and Iran had agreed upon. So, you see, this was an absolutely coordinated war. It was just a show. There were casualties, unfortunately, and this time they were quite extensive. 30 people died in Israel. In Iran, the death toll was much higher. In Israel, only 30 military personnel were killed, officers, generals, and nuclear scientists. But this time, of course, the level or intensity of emotions, the degree of confrontation, was heightened. But I am certain that if this had been a real war, and if Iran had used its missile potential, which it has been building up for decades, starting right after the Iran-Iraq War, when Iran really suffered serious damage from Iraq and began stockpiling weapons with significant help from the Soviet Union. And there, they built a whole range of military infrastructure and supplied missiles there. They also set up ballistic missile production on Iranian territory. More than 50 years have passed since then. In 50 years, Iran has accumulated thousands of missiles, and it hasn't hidden this. They have shown everyone how many missiles they have stored in basements and bunkers. If Iran had unleashed the full power of all its missile weaponry, since a ground operation here is impossible, given the vast distance between the countries, I think the damage in Israel would have been much greater. Plus, I want to point out that neither the Iranian Air Force nor the Iranian Navy took part in this war. That is, yes, the Israeli Air Force is considered one of the best in the world. But there were practically no aerial battles. At least, according to open sources, there was no mention of Iran scrambling its air force. Iran also has a large air force, with hundreds, if not thousands, of aircraft of both Soviet and Western models. And France supplied fighter jets to Iran, their Mirages. So, it was a war by agreement, and unfortunately, it involved casualties.